Imagine stepping into a boxing ring and never leaving for 7 hours. 110 rounds, broken hands, faces swollen beyond recognition. Two men, Andy Bowen and Jack Burke, refusing to quit while the world watches in disbelief. This is not a fight. This is endurance pushed to the edge, pain, pride, and a record that will never be broken. April 6, 1893, Olympic Club, New Orleans, Louisiana. The air in New Orleans that spring night was thick with anticipation, cigar smoke, and the collective breath of 1,000 men. The Olympic Club, a bastion of sporting masculinity in the American South, was packed to its ornate rafters. They had come to witness a contest for the lightweight championship of the South, a title that promised its bearer a purse of $2,500, a small fortune in an era where a working man earned $1 a day. What they would witness instead was not merely a boxing match. It would become a 7-hour and 19-minute descent into a realm where sport evaporated, strategy was annihilated, and two men were reduced, or perhaps elevated, to nothing but pure, unyielding will. This is the story of Andy Bowen and Jack Burke, and the 110-round fight that shattered bodies, redefined limits, and changed boxing forever. The Gladiators' Andy Bowen, 25, was the local favorite. A son of New Orleans, his boxing was a reflection of the city itself, rhythmic, resilient, with a touch of deceptive grace. He fought with the weight of his hometown's gaze upon him. Every friend, every critic, every gambler who had placed a bet on the Creole Cat was in those wooden bleachers. For Bowen, this was more than a title. It was a covenant with the city that forged him. Jack Burke, 24, was the Texas Spartan. His was a story written in dust and deprivation. Boxing was not a pastime, but a passage, a violent ladder out of poverty. He carried the grim determination of a man for whom every fight was a battle for survival, his fists the only tools granted to him by a hardscrabble life. He had traveled too far, endured too much to leave this ring with anything less than victory. The descent, from sport to siege. Rounds. 1:20, the promise of violence. At 9 p.m., the bell clanged. The early rounds were a masterclass in the sweet science. Bowen, the boxer, used his footwork and longer reach to pepper Burke with jabs. Burke, the brawler, stalked forward, looking to close the distance and unleash the body blows that were his trademark. The crowd roared with each clean connection. This was what they had paid for: skilled, violent artistry. By the 10th round, both men were unmarked, breathing hard but fresh, their eyes sharp with tactical fire. The 20th round arrived. The first whispers of fatigue began to show. Their breaths grew more audible over the crowd's murmur. Shirts, initially crisp, were now soaked with sweat and clung to heaving chests. Yet, the pace remained furious. A cut opened over Burke's left eyebrow, a thin red line that would become a canyon. Bowen's knuckles were raw. Still, neither man showed a hint of retreat. The crowd settled in, believing the end was surely near. Rounds 21 to 60, the unraveling of time. By the 30th round, a strange tension replaced the initial excitement. An hour had passed. The fight had already exceeded normal bounds. The boxers' movements lost their textbook precision. Punches were now thrown not just to score, but to test, to probe for a weakness that seemed not to exist. The crowd grew restless. Men checked their pocket watches. Surely, someone must fall soon. The 40th round. Past midnight, the exodus began. Working men with shifts at the docks or the rail yards muttered excuses and left. The air grew cooler, the arena less raucous. In the ring, a surreal tableau unfolded. Bowen and Burke, moving through a sludge of exhaustion, continued to trade blows. The sounds were different now. Less the sharp pop of leather on flesh, more the wet, heavy thud of immense effort. The 50th round. 2 hours in. Their bodies began to publicly betray them. Shoulders slumped. Punches lost their snap, traveling in slow, wide arcs. They clinched more frequently, not out of strategy, but out of necessity, to hold themselves upright. Their faces, illuminated by the gaslights, were masks of blank determination. The question in the air was no longer who will win, but why are they still fighting? The 60th round. The crowd had dwindled to a few hundred stunned devotees. The referee, John Duffy, watched with growing horror. His role had transformed from an arbiter of rules to a witness to a potential tragedy. Yet the rigid code of the era bound him. He could not stop a fight as long as both men were standing and answering the bell, and answer it they did. Every 60 seconds, after a brief respite on their stools where they were too tired to speak, they rose like automatons and shuffled to the center. The abyss, where will replace his muscle rounds. 61-90, the anatomy of agony, the 70th round. 3 hours. Bowen's hands, wrapped in thin horsehair and leather, were balloons of throbbing pain. Every punch sent electric jolts up his arms. He later said he felt the small bones in his hands grind like gravel with each impact. Yet he kept throwing them. Burke's broken brow bled steadily, the blood mixing with sweat and blurring his vision. He blinked it away, his world reduced to the blurred shape of the man in front of him. The 80th round. Burke threw a right hand and felt a sickening, muffled snap in his fingers. He ignored it. A few rounds later, he felt it again in the other hand. Soon both hands were broken. The pain was a white-hot furnace, but to acknowledge it was to surrender. So he cocooned it, walled it off in a distant part of his mind, and continued to fight with ruined fists. The 90th round. 4 hours. The concept of boxing was now a cruel joke. They could no longer raise their arms above their shoulders. They stood chest to chest, heads resting on each other's shoulders like weary dance partners, and delivered pathetic, slow-motion blows to each other's ribs. The sound was not of sport, but of dull, sustained trauma. The remaining spectators watched in a silence thick with awe and dread. Rounds 91 to 110, the ghosts in the ring. The 100th round. 5 hours. A surreal phenomenon occurred. Some of those who had left earlier, having slept a few hours, returned. They could not believe the fight was still ongoing. They pushed back into the club, their faces etched with disbelief, to see two specters haunting the roped square. The 105th round. Burke's world dissolved into a haze of pain and sound, the rasp of his own breath, the metronome of the bell, the distant murmur of voices. His hands were useless lumps of agony. He began to simply push at Bowen with his forearms. The 108th round. Bowen lost all sensation in his hands. He wasn't sure if he was punching or merely waving his arms in the air. His brain had severed the connection to spare him the torment. He fought on muscle memory and a singular, burning directive: do not be the first to quit. Their cornermen, normally vocal tacticians, had fallen silent hours ago. They simply poured water and wiped away blood, their faces grim. What advice could one give in the face of this? The end that was no end. Finally, at 4:34 a.m., after 7 hours and 19 minutes of continuous combat, referee John Duffy did the only humane thing left. He stepped between the two scarcely conscious men as they clung to one another in the 110th round. His voice, hoarse and cracked, cut through the dead air. The fight is declared no contest. There was no knockout, no surrender. The battle had simply reached a point beyond which human physiology could not go. It had ended because it had to end. Upon hearing the verdict, the last vestige of tension snapped. Both men collapsed where they stood, not into the dramatic sprawl of a knockout, but into a slow, crumbling descent of utter depletion. They were carried to their corners, not as gladiators, but as casualties. The aftermath, the price of the record. The immediate consequences were starkly physical. Jack Burke's hands were shattered. He would not fight again for over a year, and when he did, he was a shadow of his former self. The dynamite in his fist was gone, replaced by brittle, painful memories. He fought for a few more years but never reclaimed his former standing. Andy Bowen recovered more quickly, but a deeper damage had been done. The marathon had extracted a metaphysical toll, almost exactly 1 year to the day after the Burke fight. On April 6, 1894, Bowen stepped into the ring again in New Orleans. In a fight against a man named George Dawson, Bowen was knocked down. He rose but collapsed again shortly after and died in his dressing room from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 26 years old. The fight with Burke did not kill him directly, but many believe it left his body and spirit fatally vulnerable, a vessel already cracked by the ordeal of 110 rounds. The Tutti Aisa $100 purse, valued at nearly $80,000 today, was split evenly. Neither man could claim the title. Neither had won. Neither had lost. They left with only their share of the money and bodies that would never fully heal. The legacy, the line between courage and catastrophe. The Bowen-Burke fight of April 6–7, 1893, remains the longest recorded prize fight in history. Its legacy is etched not in triumph, but in a solemn, cautionary lesson. The rule change. The boxing world was horrified and shamed. The spectacle was seen as barbaric, a gross perversion of athletic competition. In direct response, governing bodies began to implement radical reforms. Limits on total rounds, eventually leading to the standard 12 and 15 round championships, the introduction of mandatory doctor inspections, and greater authority for referees to stop fights for the safety of the combatants. The fight created the modern concept of fighter safety, however imperfect it remains. It established that there must be a limit, that endurance could indeed become a form of destruction. The eternal question, why did they do it? The money ceased to be a motivator after the first few hours. The title became an abstract concept. Pride alone cannot explain a 7-hour ordeal. The answer lies in the terrifying and magnificent depths of the human spirit. For Bowen and Burke, in that ring, quitting became a psychological impossibility greater than any physical pain. To stop was to betray not just themselves, but their very identities, the New Orleans hero and the Texas survivor. They crossed a threshold where the fight was no longer about defeating the other, but about defying the screaming limitations of their own flesh. Their story is the ultimate exploration of the fine line between legendary courage and profound folly. It is a testament to the human capacity for suffering and a stark warning of its cost. They fought until they could not, and the world, watching in hushed horror, decided it must never happen again. They proved that the human will can demand more of the body than the body can possibly give, and in doing so, they built a monument not to victory, but to the raw, terrible, and beautiful fact of refusal. Their record stands not as a challenge to be broken, but as a monument to a boundary that was discovered at great cost so that others would not have to find it again. 110 rounds, 7 hours, 19 minutes, 2 broken men who refused to break. A record that will and must stand forever.